Hello everyone. I was in a live stream late last week with a civic nationalist. A civic nationalist being someone who makes the distinction between, well, I'm still not sure. It seems to have boiled down to shilling for this so-called liberal democracy, as if English history started with John Locke. Anyway, I made an argument that when Enoch Powell stood against continued immigration and for repatriation, with nearly the whole country behind him, that was surely part of the same culture that this civic nationalist was speaking of. This civic nationalist waved this off that the country had simply come around to a more tolerant civic ideas in the end, or something to this description. I didn't push back on him enough for this. He seemed to be working on the assumption that people had come around to the idea willingly, without coercion, and I simply can't accept this. I think I can speak for all of us when I say we know this isn't true. We've heard enough of arguments like, we've always been a nation of immigrants, or think of the full range of restaurants, or what's really British anyway? These talking points are used to cover up historical negationism. They're sometimes akin to gaslighting, but in a majority of cases the person saying them genuinely believes these points. As I'm sure many of you know, when Powell made his famous speech in 1968, a large majority of the country agreed with him, 74% to be exact. According to Simon Heffer's book, Like the Roman, at the end of April, Gallup had undertaken a survey that showed beyond question that Powell had spoken for Britain. Of those questioned, 74% agreed with what he had said and only 15% disagreed. 69% felt Heath was wrong to sack him, and only 20% felt he was right. Before the Birmingham speech, only 1% of those questioned had felt Powell would be the right man to replace Heath were there a vacancy. The favourite by far had been Maulding, with 20%. Now Powell, with 24%, was a clear favourite, with Maulding dropping to 18%. As well as having an effect on his own standing, Powell had also had an effect on the perceptions of the immigration issue. An already significant 75% of those questioned had, before the speech, felt immigration controls were not strict enough. After it, that figure rose to 83%. The survey also showed that support for Powell could not be explained by accusations of racial prejudice. Some forms of anti-discrimination legislation was felt by 65% of those surveyed to be desirable. Only 19% said they would move if immigrants came to live next to them. 2 days after the speech, on Monday, Enoch Powell was fired from his cabinet position by Edward Heath. This must have seemed very convenient to Heath, who had felt threatened by Powell for some time, as Powell had also spoken out quite virulently against joining the EU. By Wednesday, it's reported that between 1,000 and 4,500 meat market and dock workers came out in protest of Powell's treatment.
Don't just talk about London and the West Midlands. My constituency was in Devon, and the atmosphere there was absolutely electric. If Enoch Powell had stood to be leader of the Conservative Party, he'd have had a landslide at that weekend. And I dare say if he'd then stood to be Prime Minister, he would have had a national landslide.
During Powell's famous speech, he read excerpts from a letter of one of his constituents in Wolverhampton, a lady who some claimed Powell had fabricated for his own benefit. But in 1998, Mr. Kenneth Knock, a solicitor, wrote into the Express and Star, claiming to have represented the lady. This lady was later identified as Druscilla Cotterill, a widow who found herself and the Paynes at number 6 to be the last British people left on her street. She told her friend, a local pub landlord, that she felt uncomfortable and outnumbered. She wouldn't rent out lodgings to non-British families moving into the area and claimed they had smashed windows and pushed excrement through her letterbox. Though this has been disputed, apparently windows were smashed by a dead dog to be exact, and excrement had been pushed through her letterbox. But it is claimed that it wasn't to her but to a British family at number 6. According to her nephew, Druscilla Cotterill had removed herself from wider society and mostly confined herself to her kitchen at the back of her house and her bedroom. But people came around to the values of multiculturalism? Well, no. Why would I even suggest that? Hope Not Hate commissioned a YouGov poll of 5,200 people in 2018. 50 years after Enoch Powell's famous speech, and yes, they commissioned a poll of 5,200 people, and it got 11 likes on Twitter. Let that sink in. But anyway, their poll found that 41% of people believe multiculturalism has failed, with 43% of people polled believing multiculturalism has worked. However, if we compare this with polling data since 1960, compiled on the Migrant Observatory, you can see that immigration remains a pertinent issue since at least 2015, and in fact increased in public concern during the 2000s, right before about when immigration into the UK had increased drastically itself. Going back to this Hope Not Hate survey, they actually ask the question. It has been suggested that white British people could be a minority in the UK by 2060s due to current immigration patterns. If this does happen, which one or two of the following words would describe how it would make you feel? By their own data, they show that a sizable majority of British people would find their own replacement troubling. Even when they ask whether relationships will get better between communities, 3 times more people say that they will get worse than those who say they will get better. I will link the Hope Not Hate study in the description. It's quite interesting in its own way. They have a funny article about where are the rivers of blood, in which they try to weasel around some of Powell's claims. Hope Not Hate also tried to make the claim that Powell stoked the fears of racism, which is very much seems to be the liberalist approach of attributing fears to the figure that spoke of them, similar to how left-wing journos tried to attribute anti-immigrant concerns to Farage, when he had only brought up those concerns out into the open. These concerns existed and continue to exist now. Neither Farage nor Powell before him stoked anything. They simply gave a voice to the concerns of people who can otherwise be bullied into voicelessness. And when people talk of how a figure stoked fears, that's essentially a dog whistle. They're alluding to the fact that they want you silent. Similar to the joke Muslimic ray guns, where ITV cherry-picked sound bites, and then the BBC wheel out Russell Howard to deride in front of millions the concerns of the working class Brits who are otherwise not prepared through the current system to combat these false ideals of multiculturalism in a political arena where they'll be placed up against the privately educated Oxbridge political class. Looking back at how the press and the government have worked to shut down conversations surrounding this, and how this particular problem, from the public's point of view, has decreased very little, I don't see how this can be an example of liberal democracy working, or how this so-called liberal democracy, where it leads to subversion like this, can be compatible with any nationalism that disavows ethnicity or ancestry as a marker of your in-group. I'm not saying for a moment that our democratic system is to be completely done away with. It's one of the oldest democratic systems in the world that's still running today, and it would be a shame to see it go. But it needs to be wrestled back from the jaws of the cultural Marxists, and the civic nationalists don't have the principles nor the gumption to pull that off. People like our civic nationalist friend may try to pearl clutch over the idea of judging people by what they might see as materialistic distinctions. But it is these materialistic distinctions that infer other distinctions. And if any civic nationalists ask you if you've read John Locke, just tell him to go suck your godrod. British history didn't start with John Locke, and it won't end with him either. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you soon.
You were calling for the immediate reduction in numbers of immigrants coming into Britain and for the repatriation of those, or many of those already here.
That was official policy of the Conservative Party at the time.
Then why were you sacked by Ted Heath for saying it?
Because he didn't like the fact that it had been heard.